So we're picking up in this video with failed nationalisms and delayed nationalisms. Some national movements succeed and some fail. And sometimes nationalist movements are suppressed and defeated for long periods of time, but eventually emerge successful. And these successes do serve as inspirations to those involved in national struggles. One of those failed nationalisms was the disappearance of Poland. Poland, for example, was so weak from Russian territorial claims and civil war that it could not resist partition and further loss of territory. So in 1772, a third of the country, the land of the country, and half of its population was divided among Austria, Russia, and Prussia, which were its neighbors. A few years down the road, by 1791, so almost 20 years later, Poland was beginning to regain strength, but was dismembered in a second partition, this time with Russia taking most of the land. And the Poles revolted this time, but were crushed by an army of Russians and Prussians. And then just 6 years later, in 1797, there was a third partition, and this time there was nothing left. Poland was non-existent, completely off the map, until the map was redrawn after World War I in 1918 with the World War I peace treaties. So Africa, the rise and fall of states. In Africa during this time, there were a series of new religious movements that called for the purification of Islam. They didn't like that outside influence was infiltrating their religion. And so this led to the establishment of new religious-based states or religion-based states and even empires in the 18th century. And of course, it was these states that came into contact with European colonialism by 1900, and it really didn't bode well for the Africans, especially as the British had access to the Maxim machine gun, and they pretty much raised down these religious fanatics in East Africa who thought that they would be impervious to bullets. A similar thing happened in Egypt. Egypt had actually been influenced by European state building. So it stood out from the rest of Africa in that sense. They did fail to modernize their economy and politics, though, so Egypt lost its independence to European colonialism. Napoleon ruled Egypt briefly, and then the Ottomans. And the Ottoman Turks introduced some new industries and focused on the cultivation of cotton as a cash crop for Europe's booming textile industry. And they boosted the economy in that way, honestly. They used the cash crop or the profit from that cash crop to pay for new and more modern institutions. The Ottomans also encouraged students to train in Western scholarship or to even go to the West, go to Western Europe, and introduced a government printing press. And there was an important guy here. Muhammad Ali was the Egyptian governor and a professional soldier who reorganized the Egyptian army. He marched up the Nile and took Sudan and established his capital in the city of Khartoum. And I hope I'm saying that right. In 1830. And so Muhammad Ali's son, Ishmael, succeeded him. And Ishmael planned to build the Suez Canal, which of course connects the Mediterranean and the Red Seas. And this was a great plan, but it sent Egypt into debt. And it sent Egypt into a lot of debt. And European creditors who had loaned this money to Egypt began to pressure their governments to force the Khedive. I think this is maybe one of your vocab terms, but this is the title given to Muhammad Ali and his successors. But these creditors wanted to force the Khedive to use European experts as commissioners of the debt in their cabinet. And so they had to hire British finance people to go to the Egyptian government to help them manage this debt. And so the Ottoman Sultan dismissed the Khedive, and the Egyptian military revolted. So the British were forced to send in troops, and of course they crushed everyone else, and so they stayed on as the power behind the throne until 1956. So for Egypt, these European entanglements were really a double-edged sword. On one end, it spurred economic and political nationalism. On the other end, it then subverted and crippled it. European quest for power. So nationalism successfully worked to create powerful modern nation states, but at the cost of violent competition among those states. And so by 1914, Europeans had settled and were ruling, directly or indirectly, 85% of the Earth's land surface. And there's a couple of thinkers here that I want to note. The first one is Immanuel Wallerstein. And Immanuel Wallerstein gave us the term world system. And this term was used to describe the newly emerging relationships that brought together different areas of the world. Another one was Herbert Spencer. And Herbert Spencer represented, or maybe misrepresented, Darwin's concept of survival of the fittest as a doctrine that explained and even justified the rule by the strong over the weak. And so this was called social Darwinism, and it argued that those who were strong deserved their position of superiority, and those who were weak deserved their inferiority. And then a third, Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem, did I spell that right? Okay, yeah. That talked about the white man's burden. And he basically argued that Europeans had an obligation to those that they conquered to quote unquote civilize them. And it was their obligation to do that since they had conquered them. So the British in India. The British East India Company had come to India in the 1600s to buy spices and handmade cotton textiles. And they bought those with gold bullion. Gold bullion is just like gold bars. And so the Mughal government, and this is an Islamic government operating in Hindu India. So the Mughal government gave the company, the British East India Company, the right to set up trading posts, they were called factories, in crucial port locations. Well, throughout the 18th century, Mughal power began to weaken, and the British and the French, who also had a presence there, grew stronger in influence. And there were even some Indians that sided with the British against the Mughals to overthrow Mughal power as the Mughals began to crack down on non-Muslims. So basically, this left the British East India Company in charge. Like, this was the governing power in India. And as we all know, the British East India Company's main goal was to acquire profits. And so they adopted two principles to maximize their profits. Number one, they increased taxes. And number two, they manipulated tariffs. And tariffs are like a duty or a tax put on imports to encourage domestic consumption. Basically, you want people to buy your stuff, so you put a tax on the imports so people will buy your stuff because it's cheaper. So anyway, the British East India Company manipulated tariffs in India, lowering them so that British manufacturers would have easy access to British markets. And so the people would buy British goods because they weren't heavily taxed. So India really became the model colony, exporting raw materials to Great Britain, mainly cotton, and then buying the manufactured goods from Great Britain. So in a way, this was good, though. Like, Indian industry did well, and they even had a railway system in India that made possible a range of diverse activities. They could deploy troops. It would increase commerce. There was even famine relief. because with the railways, they could ship surplus foods to famine areas. It allowed people to make pilgrimages to different religious shrines. And so under British rule, India actually experienced their own industrial revolution, particularly with cotton textiles, especially in Bombay. In 1857, though, the Indians revolted against British East India Company rule, and the British came in, they crushed the revolt, and then they ruled the Indians directly rather than allowing the East India Company to rule. So the British in Burma, Malaya, and Singapore. So Burma and Malaya were both important British colonial possessions. Probably not as important as India, but still important. Burma, the neighbor to India, was actually annexed in a series of wars and was administered by the British from their Indian headquarters until 1935. But they turned the colony into a major exporter of rice, timber, and oil. And then Malaya was really profitable for its tin and rubber plantations. And then in Singapore, the British turned it into one of the largest ports in the world. Not only the largest, but one of the most geopolitically important ports in the world. And so they were classic colonies, especially Malaya and Burma, because they were exporting raw materials to Great Britain and then buying British manufactured goods. So Europeans in China, and the years we're looking at here are 1800 to 1914. And so by the early 1800s, China was facing internal problems of their own. And a lot of it was caused by their rising population that put pressure on resources and the government's administrative capacity. One of the strengths, though, of the Chinese economy was the sale of tea, silk, and porcelains to the West in exchange for silver and gold. And the European nations trading with China wanted to stop using silver and gold. They wanted China to accept Western European goods in exchange for Chinese goods. But the Chinese said, we don't need your goods, just give us your gold and your silver. However, the British discovered that the Chinese would accept payment in the form of opium, the drug opium. So they grew the opium legally in India and then transported it to China. And the people were so hooked on this drug that by the 1820s, China was purchasing so much opium that it began to give Great Britain silver. It began to export silver back to the West. So this would eventually lead to the Opium Wars. And this was really quick. You know, the Chinese government tried to clamp down on people's opium addiction. It was really bad. And so the British sent troops in and forced them to accept this type of trade. And they pretty quickly crushed the Chinese. And so this war was concluded with the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. And this treaty was important because it gave up the island of Hong Kong to the UK, and it established 5 treaty ports that were in very important locations in China. And then another treaty the next year gave most favored nation status to the UK and added provisions for British extraterritoriality. And extraterritoriality means that if you're British and you commit a crime in China, then you can go home and be tried in your own courts, where they will have sympathy on you. So the next treaty, again, gave most favored nation status to the UK and gave the British extraterritoriality. The US and France got similar concessions on the same terms as the British in treaties like a year later. So that was bad for China and their opium addicts. So the Taiping Rebellion. This was a massive rebellion or civil war in China that lasted from 1850 to 1864. And this was fought between the Qing dynasty and these Christian millenarian guys from the heavenly kingdom of peace. And this was basically I hesitate to call it a Christian sect, but the leader, Hong Chi-Quan, believed that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. And so the Taiping army, which had grown massively, marched through every regularized province of China. And this really ranks as one of the bloodiest wars in human history, the largest conflict of the 19th century, with the estimates of war dead ranging from 20 to 70 million dead. But the Taiping managed to capture Beijing, and they marched all over China, killing and razing the people down. So eventually the Qing imperial troops, who at first were largely ineffective in stopping the Taiping, gradually pushed them into the highlands, where the last Taiping loyalist, Wang Haiyang, was defeated on January 29th, 1866. So that brings us to the Boxer Rebellion, sort of an equally weird thing going on here. This was a violent anti-foreign, anti-Christian uprising that took place in China toward the end of the Qing Dynasty, between 1899 and 1901. And this was initiated by the Boxers. This was the English term for them, but basically the historians think the name came from English missionaries who were there, because they practiced calisthenics, boxing, and exercises a lot. And they thought that this type of exercise would make them impervious to bullets and cannon fire, and in some instances even give them the ability to fly. But this surprisingly turned into a massive rebellion, with growing violence against the foreign and Christian presence in Shandong and the northern China Plain in June of 1900. So the Boxer fighters, again convinced that they were invulnerable to foreign weapons, went to Beijing, and their slogan was "Support the Qing government and exterminate the foreigners." They did not like that China was becoming influenced by the West. And so there were Christians there and foreigners who were terrified, and they sought refuge in the legation quarter. And in response to reports of an armed invasion, to lift the siege, the Empress Dowager hesitantly supported the Boxers and declared war on the foreign powers. And so an eight-nation alliance was formed to put out this rebellion. And nations involved were Japan, Russia, the British, France, the United States, Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary. All of them came to put down this rebellion, and they had an army of about 20,000 people that went to China and defeated the imperial army, captured Beijing, and lifted the siege on the legations where the Christians and foreigners were seeking refuge. So we'll go ahead and end this video discussion there, and we'll pick up in the next one with the French in Algeria and Southeast Asia.